in Paris. Diane, thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on your wonderful new book.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I'm very happy to be here. I've spoken before at Allianz events in New York and San Francisco. So this will be the first time in Paris.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to hold up the cover of, I don't know if this is the final cover of the book. I just have the proof of
It
your
is,
book.
yeah.
Okay. Lorna Mott Comes Home. Actually, it's a different cover than your other books. They had all followed this kind of, this theme.
Yeah.
Why did they change it for the new book?
Well, different publisher. I think the paperbacks were Viking, maybe. And this one is Knopf, who used to be my publisher and then wasn't for a couple of books. But it's also a departure for them because, and I think it's really great. I think it's the best cover, my favorite so far.
How did you, I was always struck by this series of covers.
Yeah, no, they're good too, but.
They're good, but they imply that the book is, I don't want to say chick lit, but they imply that the books are light in a way that, or unserious in a way that they're not.
Yeah, I agree. That was my fear about them. It's something that you can't control. Has anybody asked you about a jacket?
I am allowed to weigh in, but I don't think I have any clout in the decision.
Yeah, no, me either. Not at all. I mean,
what about on the titles? Do you get to weigh in on that?
The titles I figure out myself.
Yeah.
Often with help from, my friends, my husband, etc. Yeah. So it's always hard to arrive at a title, but the jacket, the publishers are very proprietary about that. But this time, I think it's really a home run.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, I have so much I want to ask you about this book. But I guess one thing that really intrigued me from the start and really drew me to the book is the fact that the writer is a woman of a certain age. She's, I think, late 50s, early 60s. You say she's in her quote unquote middle years. And a lot of the book is her trying to find out what that stage of life means, who she is. Is she still attractive? Is she allowed to have a career still? What is that period? And it struck me that many of your earlier books had quite young women as their protagonists, the sort of ingenue characters. So what made you decide on this age, Lorna's age?
Well, it was exactly the issue that you raised. That is, I wondered if a middle-aged woman could be the heroine of a novel that would interest anyone. And I knew that I couldn't actually make her as old as I actually am, because Lorna's a bit younger than I. But I thought we'll compromise on late 50s, early 60s and leave it kind of up in the air.
Why couldn't you make her as old as you are?
Well, I think that's a whole another issue of another stage of life with other issues, when people get to be really senior. And I didn't want her quite there yet, with still to have maybe romantic possibilities, career aspirations, etc. Yeah. And mostly by the time you get to my age, you know who you are and your career, if any, is established, and you're lucky to still be alive. So
one thing that you write about through Lorna is, which I haven't seen written about much in novels, is her relationship with her adult children. And you say at one point that she was aware that she must not interfere with their lives or give the slightest sign of being bossy. She's trying to be present in their lives without being overbearing. Is this a topic that you also felt needed to be?
Yes, actually, I brought a lot of my personal experience to this book. And that's one of the things that as your children get to be adults, you have to consider. And Lorna has nice children, so as I do.
she wonders at one point in the book whether she's reached that tipping point where they're taking care of her instead of her taking care of them. Is that a sort of something that you struggled with in your life as well, or wondered
Well,
about?
I wouldn't say I've struggled, but I have noticed that my children are now saying, how are you, Mom? Or, you know, kind of a little more, professing a little more caretaking impulses than there is a kind of equilibrium, and I feel the weight shifting as they become more independent. Well, they're, you know, themselves middle-aged people. So they, it's just a phenomenon that I've been interested in, that they start kind of taking care of me.
Is that an uncomfortable switch, or are you settled into that at this point?
No, it's comfortable. It's Amanda and I are going to a sewing class tomorrow, or a class in making paper patterns, because we're all very crafty. And, you know, we have fun together, which, you know, Amanda wouldn't have had time to do that in her younger years when her children were small. Now we can do stuff like that. It's fun.
I was struck when I was reading this book, because you've written so much about Americans in Paris, that one of your early novels was a horror novel. And it was about a woman who thinks she's being pursued by a sort of violent attacker, but isn't quite sure and doesn't know which is real, what's happening in her mind, or if that corresponds to reality. And people said a lot about your writing that, you know, you just switched to these light comedies of manners. But it struck me when I was reading that it's kind of the American in Paris story is similar, because you're sort of never sure which reality is the real one, and that this has a lighter theme, but in a way it's the same.
I suppose it's the same. But again, like any writer, I draw from my own life. And when I wrote The Shadow Knows, I was recently divorced and heard funny noises outside, and had some of the experiences that came out in the book. When I wrote Le Divorce, which was the first of the novels set in Paris, it was because we'd come to France for a year's sabbatical. And so it was again reflecting my my experience, but to live in France is much more agreeable than living in a kind of slummy place actually in Los Angeles. Uh, so I don't think I have to make very much up in my life, in my writing.
So do you feel that you are always the protagonist in your novels?
Yeah, I'm all the characters. I think novelists would all say that you have to be all the characters. You have to understand where they're coming from, and they do express some aspect of you. So yes.
Interesting. One theme, speaking of moving to France, that you write a lot about in Le Divorce and in this book as well, is infidelity. And I thought I would just read, maybe if you don't mind, a small section from the book so we can be introduced a little bit to Lorna and who she is. She's an American woman who, for her second marriage, marries a very dashing Frenchman and moves to a village in France. And I'll just read very quickly 2 paragraphs. People had liked his American wife, Madame Lorna Dumas, the small, pretty, high-strung woman who had publicly left that morning. Everyone had seen trouble coming. In the last few months, their house had abruptly been leased to an English family and was also for sale, and Monsieur Dumas was negotiating pleasant temporary rooms over the boulangerie. Some said that before this final fracas, young Madame Trebon, wife of the baker, had been seen delivering brioches to Monsieur Dumas in the late afternoons when Madame Lorna was out. Next to the voluptuous Madame Trebon, Madame Lorna looked like a slightly desiccated sprite, seeming young until you looked more closely. Then you thought, well, young for her age. Lorna and Armand Luc, that's her husband, had been married 20 years. It was unclear when during the preceding months her frequent absences, away during her lectures, had become the status quo, but something in her manner made everybody predict that this time she wouldn't be back. And who could blame her? Everyone liked Monsieur Dumas, but he was a notorious tombeur, that is, a skirt chaser. It's a wonderful passage, and it really shows what an incredible observer you are of people. And I wonder, in terms of Lorna's husband is as you say here, is a sort of notorious philanderer. The whole town knows what's going on, but she kind of tolerates his philandering in what would seem almost to be a kind of French way. She's irritated, but she's not leaving him because of that.
That's right. But you're actually the expert on this. I remember you did research and wrote a book about French infidelity. And I remember you coming to talk to me, at which time I didn't really know much about it because French wives had not confided their feelings about their husband's infidelity. So I had no firsthand information actually, and had to just infer and read your book.
So it's an ongoing theme, I think, in all of your novels, is trying to figure out what the French approach to infidelity really is. Do you feel like you understand it now? It seems from your...
Not really, because in fact, the French people I know either they don't talk about it or they're not unfaithful to their spouses. Maybe just our milieu, which is kind of square doctors and I don't know, expatriate Americans.
I guess that's why they call it a secret garden here. They really are extremely discreet. People don't talk about their private lives.
No, they don't. So you just have to wing it when it comes to novel writing.
Why did you decide to set the novel in a small town instead of, say, in Paris, where you had set your previous ones?
Well, not much of it is actually set there, because most of it is set in San Francisco.
True.
So yeah. I knew I just had to start her out somewhere and invent her French life. And I thought it would be nice for her to live in a nice village. And French villages are so pretty. And, it had to be slightly boring for her to want to leave. So Pont-les-Puits. And then it's set in San Francisco. A lot of it is set in San Francisco. And that was one of my ideas, that this should be a book not about an American going to France, as my first one, Le Divorce, was of the French novels. It should be the bookend. An American, having lived in France for a long time, goes back to America. And since San Francisco is where I live, that's where I set it. And also, I expected it to be more satiric in looking at America, that it was going to be a vehicle for more comment than it turned out to be, probably, about contemporary America. But in fact, when I got home, America, it quickly seemed normal, though appalling, the homelessness and the parking problems and all the things that I do talk about in the book.
She gets back to San Francisco and she's left her husband behind, and she wants to reestablish herself in middle age. And she goes to the real estate agent she knew 20 years prior, and she says, "Oh, get me a place in I can't remember which hill."
Russian Hill, Nob Hill.
Hill, Nob Hill. Just find me a nice place in one of the hills. And the real estate agent says, basically, for your budget, she starts showing her these like dingy one bedrooms on the outskirts of town. And I thought that was really, she's come back to an America that is not what she remembers.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was my game in that situation. And a little bit, I'm always struck when I go back in the summers at the changes, even in 1 year, from year to year.
She's very excited going back because she thinks I'm finally going back home. In fact, everything that was wrong with me was really just me missing America. And she thinks I'm really deeply American and I'm going to finally fit in this place. But Do you sometimes feel that way when you go back, or?
No, I feel deeply American and I slot right into American life, I think. And after a couple of weeks, I don't even notice the things that I notice first when I get back, the problems. I think once American, you just are.
Yeah.
And yeah. But I also feel always happy to be back in France. I feel American, but I don't want to be there necessarily. It's because it's a lot easier to live in France. I think somewhere in the book, Lorna thinks you have to be tough to live in America.
What do you think's easier about living in France?
I think just superficial things, really. For instance, not having to drive a car, park it, and get it repaired. That, that's the most obvious, simple thing. Having things delivered here is much easier than there. You don't have to go fetch everything. The medical system is much more accessible, and much better. Those are just a few things, but I think we could all go on and on. The bakeries are delicious, and you don't have to go 10 miles to find one. The pharmacy is right around the corner. There are 8 movie theaters within walking distance of my apartment.
And yet everything's in French, obviously. I mean, that to me is
and
language to me is the biggest challenge to living here.
That is certainly a challenge, but as you know, the longer you're here, the less of a challenge it is. The more your French improves. And so, though I would never say I was a good French speaker, I remember not being able to say a word at the beginning. And I must have said this somewhere. I was careful to ask for 2 things so that you didn't have to specify the gender of the noun. Deux oranges.
Deux oranges de baguettes, yeah.
Wait.
But do you still, even after all these years, struggle to remember what's masculine and what's, because I know I do.
Yes, I have no sense at all of it. Yeah, unless it positively ends in ETTE or some other really clear indication. I'm completely at sea. And I noticed actually that some French people are too. They'll say le divorce. They'll correct themselves just as a.
Perhaps they have not been divorced.
Well, yeah, or some other noun. Just, yeah.
You write about Lorna in the book. Whatever she did in their village, she'd always be the awkward American woman, never quite right, said to once have had some career in America, but never ever getting the cheeses straight.
Yes, and that's still a problem that I have. I know there's an order, and I know there's a selection that has to be, but I've boiled it down now. For instance, tonight, where 6 people are coming to dinner, we're just having Roquefort and Époisse, because those are the 2 cheeses that I like. Oh, and maybe a hard cheese of some kind, but I haven't.
What is Époisse? And now I'm feeling.
Oh, Pamela, you have to try Époisse. It's like a very strong camembert in that it's runny, or should be, and it comes in a box, but you don't take it out of the box. You just scoop it out of the box.
I've had that one. I like that one. It's really strong. Okay, maybe we both have our cheeses straight. This is a relief.
Maybe so. At least we boil them down to the ones we like.
Probably the French do too, if they would admit it.
Yeah.
Another theme of the book, which we touched on briefly, is the arc of a career, and especially of a woman's career. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit with Lorna, because she's an academic, she's an art historian, she's been out of the market, the academic market, and out of sort of the American landscape for 20 years. And then she tries to, again, insert herself back into it. And she finds that she's lost some currency, that she's no longer the sort of hot young academic that she once was. how do you look at the arc of Lorna's career, of a woman's career typically, and how it goes, and especially from the age you are now? You know, you're still publishing, you're still working. What how do you grapple with all that?
Well, I think if have a career and you're interested in it, and it's like mine, writing, where it doesn't require going to an office or being retired in any official way, you just keep going. Um, and Lorna's a bit in that position, but her problem is that she's been out of the academic and lecture circuit. She was an art historian who gave colorful and interesting lectures about works of art, in especially in France. So she doesn't have to stop, but she does have to refine her market or her contacts so that she'll be invited to places to speak. So that's her problem. But otherwise, I think, you know, women have the same problem as men. If they're academics, and they'll be retired when the university says they must, but then they have to adjust just the way men do.
What about for you? And I'm asking really for personal reasons, as a writer in her 50s, how, as a writer in your 80s, like what's it like to kind of keep going all those years? Was there a point where you thought, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to be doing this anymore, maybe I'm not relevant anymore, maybe I'm not suggesting that in any way, but I mean, it's something that I struggle with, and I wonder how you think about that.
I think about it. I haven't thought about it. I think that's the answer, that I just, you know, keep going without reference to increasing age. And sometimes when I realize how long it's been, how many, you know, when somebody says, that was 60 years ago, I'm just astounded. I think the best thing is just not to think about it and keep doing what interests you. And if your interests change, well, that's fine. Just, you know, to keep being creative. I don't know what it would be like if I were a CPA or something like that.
I think that's very good advice. And Linda, thank you for telling us all how to spell that cheese. I think there were probably plenty of people wondering in the audience.
Yes, I have a little window that.
Well, yes. It's very inspiring to hear you say that. And I think basically you're saying don't be too neurotic about it.
Exactly. Now, yeah, just try not to think about it. Just think about what, you know, what's your next project.
It occurs to me too that while you do a variety of writing, including wonderful criticism, that you keep going back to this kind of WASP milieu, if I may call it that. These kind of restrained Protestant Californians and the world around them. And to some extent, that world, as you write about it in this book, is kind of crumbling around some of them. They've had to move into dingier quarters. Not just Lorna, but one of her daughters who's having a hard time. What is it about that world that fascinates you, or is it just the world that you come from?
It's just the world I come from. Yeah, I remember that kind of being brought home to me years ago when I got a letter from Vivian Gornick. It was about a novel of mine called Lying Low. I've never forgotten this. And it was, you know, it was fairly admired book. It was a finalist for the National Book Award and stuff. And so people wrote to me, and but Vivian said, well, but you know, it's all very well, except the people are Episcopalians. Like, that was sort of weird.
How could you not write about Jews? What's the matter with you?
Well, that was the implication. Yeah, like every other novelist. So, you know, I had to really think about that. And, you know, the competing maxim is write about what you know. So that's what I've always done.
Another thing I've noticed in your novels is you're very good at external, especially the French ones, externalizing people's problems through administrative matters. Like there's the settlement of a will or the sale of a painting, or in this book, there's a kind of collapse of a graveyard that needs to be dealt with. What is it? Is it French administration that inspires you in this way?
No, I think that's just a realistic observation about life. Like think of the lives of all the survivors of the collapsing building in Florida, and think of all the paperwork that is ahead of them and all the nightmare of, setting aside the tragedy and the sadness, all that they're going to have to go through with the insurance companies in America. And more life than we realize is it's not just France that generates a lot of paperwork and licensing, and I have
It's
to go
true.
into my
Why wouldn't we write novels about what my British husband calls personal admin? Like that is mostly what we do.
It's mostly what we do, but it's so boring and irritating that it doesn't really, we don't want to write about it, and nobody would like to read it either.
And yet we do in your books. You managed to turn it into high drama.
Yeah, well, yeah. Of course, I mean, like, I don't know, James, to make an immodest reference or comparison, there's always something, maybe in most novels, there's always something in the external world which operates as a plot twist, if nothing else, something to hang the relationships and things on.
And certainly inheritance issues bring out a kind of deep part of people's character too.
Yeah. Several of my novels have inheritance issues, now that I think about it. The Marriage, this one, Le Divorce.
The divorce as well.
Yeah.
Also, like Henry James, to draw out the very good comparison, I think, you have a lot of characters in your book. They're all named, and we get background on all of them. What do you like populating your books with lots of people, or isn't it hard to keep track of them all?
No, it's not hard. If they're yours, you can kill them off if you get bored with them. But no, but there are more characters in Lorna than there usually are, and well, a lot of Lorna comes from an inheritance issue in my family, and so I actually toned down the number of children and cousins involved, but there's still a lot of characters. I hope the reader can keep them straight. Somebody told me they couldn't actually. And it suggested one of those things like in a Russian novel where you put in the frontispiece a little list of characters and
maybe a family tree to help us keep it all straight. I was curious about how your books have been received in France. I know several of them have been translated into French, probably more than I know. I noticed that Le Mariage, in the French version of Le Mariage, is called Mariage à l'Américaine, and Le Divorce is called Une Américaine à Paris, an American in Paris. How are you treated? The French love their writers, of course. Do you feel that how are you treated here? And how have your books been
received? Well, I think ignored, basically. I haven't really had, most of my books are not translated. And some publisher explained to me, maybe the publisher of Le Divorce, who changed the title, because she said, Le Divorce, what's that? For French people, it's just a normal noun, and it would seem like nonfiction. And so they added the American. But somebody explained that the French don't really like Americans writing about them. So I tell myself that's the explanation for the fact that a lot of my books have not been published here at all.
Nor are we, aside from de Tocqueville and a few others, very curious about what they think about us, to be fair.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
I guess so many Americans come to Paris thinking that they have something to say. And so it's frustrating if the people that we're writing about don't want to hear it.
Yeah. And basically they don't tell us much either. So apart from Tocqueville, we don't have a lot of French comedy, maybe BHL. Not too many people, French people comment on America, except in the paper.
Simone de Beauvoir actually wrote a wonderful nonfiction kind of account of her trip to America and all the people she met in New York and traveling around. I think she was on a book tour.
Oh, I never have read that.
Yeah,
I think she took up with Nelson Algren or somebody.
I think she definitely stopped in to see him then in Chicago at some point in the trip. It was obliquely referred to. So you were by the book column in the New York Times recently. I think it was last week, and it's a Q&A in which you talk about all the books that are on your nightstand and that you've read recently and that have influenced you and that make you laugh and that you come back to. And I was just struck by how much it seems that you read and how deeply immersed in books you are in your everyday life, which I suppose should not be surprising given that you're a writer, but I have to say in this day and age is complicated. It's hard to read. We're also distracted by social media and by telephones and everything else, and by Netflix and all that, that even writers don't really read that much anymore. I hate to.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true. I really look forward to, climbing into bed at night with my Kindle and catching up on things or plunging back into things that I've been reading, because during the day, very hard to sit down and just disappear into a book. I think that's generally true.
Do you do social media? Do you have a smartphone?
No, I think that is one that it makes it easier to read. I just decided as a kind of administrative decision not to get lured into social media. So I never go onto Facebook, and I don't know what the others are. LinkedIn. I do respond to LinkedIn when someone says, please join, or can I be a friend or something. I always say, of course. But are there others? I'm sure there are.
What about Twitter? You've never been on Twitter?
I've never been on Twitter. Perhaps, I mean, the publishers want you to do that, I think, but they've never required it. So.
And you don't feel like your writing loses. It doesn't seem to me that your writing loses anything because you don't.
Some kind of contemporary quality or being up on things. Well, I hope it doesn't, but it probably does. That was one reason I set the novel Lorna in 2008 rather than 18 or now.
Oh, interesting.
So I could skip Trump, which I felt would be more than I could deal with. The shift in American, politics and so on would definitely have had to involve Lorna, and she would have had to notice it, and therefore I would have had to write about it. So, so it was easier to have it just 10 years before, which is actually a common novelistic. I mean, Dickens always said his books 10 years before, and James also, and all the novelists I can think of.
Do you think that you at some point want to write about Trump, or is it just too much?
It's too much, and I don't understand it yet. Maybe we'll all come to understand what that phenomenon was, but I don't understand. And the other thing is, in America, I live in a kind of bubble of San Francisco, where no one virtually voted for Trump, and there's no ambiance that would explain it. And well, it's a bubble, a Silicon Valley driven bubble. So I haven't had much experience of knowing a Trump voter, for example.
I was hoping we could, I just want to say to the audience that if you have questions for Diane, please put them in chat. I've seen a couple, but please feel free to keep putting them through. Oh, someone else, a good question, Janine Cowart. And maybe, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, Diane, what age is your readership generally? Have your readers followed you and gotten older?
I don't know if they followed me as I've gotten older, but I think they remain, younger than I, and probably in, how old are people when they have time to read? In their 30s, in their 40s.
In their 40s, they stop because they have 30s. Well, they stop when they have young kids, and then they start reading again.
Yeah, exactly. So after the kids are in school, whatever.
And what about your process as a writer? I remember, I hope I'm not talking out of school, but running into you once at an American Library event, and we were talking, and I think I was taking notes, and we talked about how it's important to just write down every thought when it happens, because you end up with these, tiny pieces of paper with ideas on them. Is that something you do that you've always done? And what do you do with all the pieces of paper? Because I have no idea what to do with mine.
No, I don't. In fact, I don't. I've always been a very bad note taker. I have a notebook, and I do put plot ideas in if something occurs to me, but only rather intermittently. And I don't keep a daily journal, which people all advise writers to do, but I don't. And I always swear to do better, but I haven't. So I figure if it remains in my memory, then that's worth,
it's a good test.
Probably has stood a certain test. But of course, as my memory gets feebler, I don't know if I can depend on that principle.
Then it has to be a really good idea.
That's really good,
yeah. Someone else is asking a question. Do you find life easier as you mature in France, or for at your age, do you find France easier?
Yes, much easier. For some of the reasons I mentioned, not having to drive,
right?
Having easier to get household help. Again, I started to say medical care. The medical care is probably better in France, but in fact, I'm wedded to my American HMO, and so I do have to go back to go to the doctor and the dentist and stuff. But I don't know, just in myriad ways, it seems easier here. So it's flat. It's all the museums and things are more accessible, and there are more of them, which makes it ideal for an aging person to have a lot to do. In America, lots of seniors, live someplace in rural or suburban Cincinnati or something. Where can they get to without a car?
Right.
And where would they go? Where do they even want to go to without a museum? Well, there is a museum in Cincinnati, but I think, or no, Cleveland is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
A great museum.
We have a question from the great Alan Riding. He says, you used to teach creative writing. Did you find your students copying the way you write? That's a very interesting question.
I probably approved and smiled at the ones who did without realizing that was what they were doing. But I wasn't conscious of it.
I wanted to, please keep sending in your questions. We have time for a few more, but I wanted to mention your husband, John Murray, who sadly died last year of COVID. He was a very esteemed pulmonologist, and he was the one who initially brought you to France.
Yes, it was his work with an NGO to do with world tuberculosis. that was based in Paris.
And
I was going to say he'd retired. He was a professor at the University of California Medical School, and then he retired from there and took this job with the NGO. And so it was his idea. Everyone tended to assume it was mine because of me writing about France, but it wasn't. And I was, in fact, rather slow to adjust. But
slow to adjust in what way?
well, I think it was because of the language. I didn't speak French, and so I felt a little at sea and had to learn French.
At what point did you realize that France was going to be kind of rich material for your writing?
Well, I think right away. I wrote Le Divorce almost right away when I landed here, because I needed something to do, and so it was in effect a kind of taking of notes about France, but I had to, of course, invent a story. And the story actually came from a neighbor. It's a pretty common story among Americans that I met at that time, which is au pair girl comes to Paris, meets the adorable Frenchman, marries, divorces, decides to stay.
Figures out that her relationship to France wasn't contingent on the man, actually, in the end.
Perfect way of putting it. Yeah.
You mentioned in an interview that your husband and possibly you as well are involved in a monthly Shakespeare. We're involved in a monthly Shakespeare reading group in Paris. Can you tell us a little bit about
right.
that?
And I've seen a couple of Alan writing for one who checked in. Barry is here somewhere. Barry Zwicker, Joan Squires Lind. So there, three of our denizens are with us, or if they haven't left. And
you read a different play every month?
Yes, it went on for several years, and we talk of reviving it. The COVID and everything sort of killed it for a while, but yes, we met monthly, read a Shakespeare play, and a different play each time, and had dinner.
Nice. Someone else asked a very good, simple question is, what did you think of the movie version of Le Divorce?
Well, I liked it, and I loved James Ivory and Ishmael Merchant. They were wonderful to work with. But I felt the result was different from the book. And that was okay. It was just its own thing. It had their character and their preoccupations. And so I enjoyed the movie a lot and liked it. But I didn't feel that it was really Le Divorce.
What was it missing?
No, it had changed some of the plots and characteristics. It wasn't, I don't know exactly. The emphasis was just slightly different. And part of it, I think, was because of the screenwriter, Ruth Power Jobvala, who had her own take on things. And one example of her take was that she was going to have Isabel, who's the heroine, who's having the affair with an older diplomat, get pregnant at the end. And decide to have the baby or not have the baby. I think have the baby and her waters break in the Place de la Concorde or something. And off she goes and that was just exactly the ending that Jobvala had just written for the Forster novel. Blanking on the Forster novel.
Someone's going to put it in chat. They'll tell us what it is.
Yeah, yes, please. And where the unmarried girl has a baby at the end. And that was so wrong for Isabel. Why would she want a baby? The whole idea is she's now launched into the world of adventure and grown-up life and so on. Howard's Inn. Thank you, Peggy. Yes, exactly.
Did you put your foot down?
It was the only time yeah, I did. And so luckily did the producer, a Francophile who also thought it was totally wrong. So they had actually shot the scenes in the Place de la Concorde and everything and had to reshoot the last maybe 10 minutes of the film.
Oh, wow. I would like to get my hands on that footage just to see the outtakes.
I know. I wonder if it still exists. It'd be interesting to know.
And who is the Diplomat based on? I've always wondered about that.
Well, his name it was based on an elegant French friend whose first name is Edgar. And so I partly wanted to amuse him, but it wasn't, it was based on sort of my impression of French diplomats and also seeing younger women and older men in nice restaurants or at concerts seems to be quite common. And, Frenchmen taking out their nieces quite a bit.
Their nieces in quotes.
Their nieces, yeah, nieces. So that was the inspiration.
And I didn't get a chance to ask you earlier, but earlier in your career, I think it was with your first husband, you moved to Iran. It was right before the revolution.
No, that was with John. That was with John.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
And you wrote a novel about that experience, which was actually nominated for
yes, Persian Nights. Yeah, and it came to seem rather topical as Iran came back into world affairs. But we were there in 1979, which was just the time of the fall of the Shah. The University of California was sending its faculty over to lecture in the medical school in Shiraz. And then suddenly the country was in upheaval, the Shah fell and left, and we were sort of stranded at an awkward time. Soon after we managed to get out, the consulate people were taken hostage. So we actually escaped from Iran. But that was, of course, wonderful for the novelist, for, writing a novel about. It's still pretty apposite. Persian Nights, not much has changed.
It strikes me as a writer who is neurotic and often gets in her own way, which I think is a big problem for a lot of writers, that you are just so pleased to have material that when you get your hands on it, you use it, you write it. I'm sure it's not easy, but you do kind of make it look. You don't seem afraid of yourself or of your own material.
Well, good. And I don't think I really am. That is, I really look forward to experience and John was a great husband for a writer because he was invited a lot of different places for lectures and this world tuberculosis thing. And so I had the fun of going to a lot of different places and seeing a lot of interesting things. So.
Did he read you?
Yes. Yeah, he was always my first reader and good reader.
Do you have a writing, I'll just ask you a few last questions before we have to end. Do you have a writing routine? I'm sure a lot of writers in the audience would like to know that.
I try to write in the mornings just because, the day hasn't taken over. But I think because I have children, when the children were small, you had to grab time when you could. And so I have remained that kind of intermittent person too. I mean, I tried to grab writing time when I can.
Right.
I think it's good to have a routine, though.
Yeah.